Hello, everybody out there. This is a bit of an experiment, but we hope it's going to work. And the Chief Executive of the BSA, Judith Mudd, is going to say a few words first.
Good afternoon and welcome to this British Sociological Association Symposium. Today's topic is Sociology on and beyond the COVID-19 crisis. This event is being brought to you in the week when hundreds of sociologists would have been gathering for our annual conference if it wasn't for the pandemic. In the chair today we have Sue Scott, BSA past president, and Sue suggested this symposium to us and worked closely with our current president, Susan Halford, and our staff to make it happen. Our thanks go to the staff, to Sue, Susan, and to all our wonderful panellists today who gave up their time, agreed to join us at very short notice. In a moment, Sue will introduce the panel to you and we'll tell you a bit about the thinking behind the event. We hope our technology is kind to us this afternoon and your experience is uninterrupted and thought-provoking. Please do tweet during the symposium. Our hashtag is BSACovid. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Judith. Thanks very much. And yeah, we've got almost 300 participants in already, but I think we need to press on. We have 500 people registered, which is wonderful. Okay, a warm welcome from me to this symposium. As Judith said, fingers crossed that all goes well technically. Thanks to Judith for agreeing to run with the idea, and also thanks to the BSA staff, and especially to Sandria Charalambos for making sure that the show got onto screens. We're delighted that there was so much interest in participating in this event. I don't know how many non-BSA members are out there, but a special welcome to you. And I hope that you'll look at the BSA website for other events and perhaps think about joining us. I thought it would be a good idea to have an event focused on the COVID-19 crisis during what would have been the BSA annual conference, and I'm really pleased that it's happening, but a bit anxious about chairing it. We wanted to give voice to the important things that social scientists and especially sociologists have to say. The focus on epidemiology and public health is of course crucial, but it's also important that we explore the social implications of the science, of the government advice, and of the pandemic itself, both now and into the future. There's been much talk in the media about individual behavioural responses and of course the infamous nudge. But as sociologists, we've always known that we're not just individuals and that it's the social and relational that shapes our everyday routines and practices, and also the possibilities for change. It's important that the skills and knowledge that we have are put to good use in these challenging times. And this symposium is one contribution to sharing ideas and developing our thinking. We didn't want to focus only on the immediate aspects of the situation, health and lockdown, but also on the wider and longer term implications and possibilities. We're delighted to have such an excellent set of speakers who will focus on a number of different aspects, issues and arguments, both directly and indirectly related to COVID-19. I will now introduce our speakers in alphabetical order and then ask them to speak in an order that seems to offer the most coherence. During the presentations, I'll be moving swiftly from one speaker to the next, and all questions will be taken at the end. Meanwhile, please send your questions as text via the Q&A as they arise to you, and I'll put as many of them as possible to the speakers between 3 and 3:30. It would help if you made your questions brief, and if you could indicate which speaker or speakers you wish them to be directed to. Now I'm going to introduce the panel, and if each of them would wave when I say their names. First, we have Bridget Anderson, who is Professor of Mobilities, Migration and Citizenship at the University of Bristol and Direction of Migration and Mobilities Bristol. She's currently working on methodological denationalism, and her other interests include citizenship, nationalism, immigration enforcement and care labour. She's worked closely with migrants' organisations, trade unions and legal practitioners at local, national and international level, And today she will invite us to think outside of the box, outside of the national box. Next, we have Nik Brown. Thanks, Nik, who is Professor in the Sociology of Health and Illness at the University of York. For the last few years, he's been a PI on a number of funded research projects, exploring the links between infectious diseases, social distancing, and healthcare architectures. His most recent monograph is published by Palgrave and entitled Immunitary Life, a Biopolitics of Immunity. Today, he's going to be talking about the way social distancing represents a new turn towards the atmospheric environment of the body. Next, we have Ipek Demir. Ipek, you wave at us? Who is an associate professor in sociology and social policy at the University of Leeds. She's an interdisciplinary sociologist and works on topics encompassing diaspora, race, the global south, politics of knowledge, and epistemology. Today, she's going to talk about coronavirus, risk, and Westerncentrism. And then we have Danny Dorling, who is professor in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. His book, Slow Down, The End of the Great Acceleration and Why It's Good for the Planet, the Economy, and Our Lives, is published by Yale and is literally just out. His next book, Fintopia, What We Can Learn from the World's Happiest Country, written jointly with Annika Kojonen, will be published later this year. And he's going to talk about stepping back to focus on the future. And last, but by no means least, we have Susan Halford, who is the current BSA president. Susan is Professor of Sociology and co-director of the newly established Bristol Digital Futures Institute at the University of Bristol. Her research stretches across the social, computational, and engineering sciences. She's active in promoting sociological engagement across disciplines and beyond the academy. And here she will explore the effects of COVID-19 on digital futures. Our speakers will have a maximum of 12 minutes to speak. I will let them know when they have 2 minutes left, but if they keep going after 12 minutes, I will mute them. This is the only time I think I've had quite that much power as a chair. It may not be wise. The speakers will share their screens to show slides, and we hope it all works. And I'm now going to turn to Nik Brown, who is our first speaker. Nik.
Thank you, Sue. I'll just try and share my screen. Okay. So you can see that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, well, in a few short months and weeks, COVID-19 has ushered in a historically radical transformation in how we move and interact and breathe and work and live and heal and die and mourn. Most of us are now painfully learning a whole new way of life built around social distancing, self-isolation, notions of quarantine, situating ourselves in an entirely new bodily geometry, learning what 2 meters looks like, of checking ourselves when passing other people on footpaths, of standing back, of imagining the body surrounded by an atmospheric halo of air. So that geometry is inscribed in our streets with tape showing where to stand in line, grocery stores marking out the space between one body and that of another. And suddenly the volume of air around the body matters in a way that would have seemed like madness just a few short months ago. For most people, these are entirely new etiquettes of spacing, of imagining the invisible and envisioning airborne threats encircling the bodies of oneself and others. And yet for some people, that 2 meter rule or the 6 foot rule has long been a way of life. So the last 2.5 years, myself and colleagues have had the privilege working with hospital respiratory clinics, treating people with cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis has a number of life-shortening comorbidities, but especially virulent and chronic lung infections. So up to about 20 years ago or so, people with CF would have been encouraged to spend lots of time together on hospital wards, but socially on holidays and through clubs and so on. But it was established that that embodied mutual support and social contact had triggered the cross-infection of epidemic infections, infections increasingly resistant to antibiotics, becoming untreatable in many cases. So over the last few decades, living with CF has increasingly come to depend upon a hygienic regime of spatial and atmospheric segregation. So ritualized etiquettes of social distancing, a keen acuity to infection risks carried on the air. So the segregation of individual patients has reduced transmission, cohorting patients with the same type of infection has reduced cross-infection. But now today, in the context of a global pandemic, this profound state of emergency, once inhabited by the very few, has now come to enfold the entire world. We've all now become transfigured into a vaporous source of infectious transmissibility, to be isolated, imposing new self-pedagogies of hygienic prudence and containment within what Nicholas Fox once called circuits of hygiene, or Jessica Mesman calls sterility as a product of spatial ordering. So there's probably lots to learn from people who've been there before and for whom this has long been a way of life. Much of what I'm saying here stems from a paper coming out just right now in the journal Sociology of Health and Illness. Caring for lung infections is a matter of constantly struggling to remember the forgettable and envision the invisible. The fact that air doesn't easily show itself, as Irigaray puts it, is a constant preoccupation in respiratory care. The air is clouded in doubt. The tour points out that certain events move air from the implicit to the explicit. And for Sloterdijk, the gas attack on Ypres is an airquake, or what he calls an airquake, that converts air into an object of explication to be understood. So the respiratory clinic and now life under COVID-19 focuses attention on the atmosphere of the body and its co-isolated adjacency, he calls it, or foam life. Now in the aerographic imagination of the clinic, the bodies of the infected are envisioned surrounded by a communicable mist, a personal cloud of biotic life following patients through space. So the metaphor of the cloud body is coined in microbiology to designate bodies that are seen to shed viruses and bacteria in great quantities. And the very idea of the cloud repositions the body as a transmissible bioaerosol, an imaginative way of grasping the otherwise unintelligible and making the air apparent. So by loosely symbolizing the patient as a volume of air, the cloud re-envisions the unseen whilst itself remaining invisible. And this recently found cinematic expression in the film 5 Feet Apart. This is a story of a tragic romance that develops between two CF teens, unable to hold hands. They wander around together, holding the opposite ends of a 5-foot pool cue. So the title itself derives from the 6-foot rule, which we're all becoming very familiar with, but the two lovers here having daringly closed that distance by 1 foot. So meticulous spatial observances of this kind are common amongst participants in our study, many of whom are incredibly anxious about things like public spaces, but especially areas like hospital waiting rooms and waiting areas. So one CF patient, this is Tina, for example, described how she would choose a seat as far away from others as possible and secure that area by spreading her belongings on adjacent chairs to preserve her own discrete sense of space and to create what she called her own personal bubble. This is a delineated volume within which to cough without drawing unwelcome attention and to be protected from the coughs of others. Other patients point out that you can't always live life in a bubble. Life has to move, life has to be risky. Now, a lot of people that we've worked with describe how they'll often hold their breaths at moments of perceived respiratory threat. And in fact, I've also heard clinicians treating COVID-19 patients who also hold their breath because they're anxious about the effectiveness of their PPE kit. So it's in this sense that the body becomes a new kind of atmosphere, occupying a new kind of aerosolized space. Sloterdijk talks about this as foam or foam life, where breathing occurs in foam-like spheres of co-isolated adjacency. A membranous living of this kind requires continual labor to maintain a thin defensive sheath that's always easily disposed towards collapse. But the story that we tell is also partly historical about the changing hospital architectures and healthcare spaces in which we all receive treatment. So as we're seeing right now, infectious disease calls for entirely new forms of architecture, building design, spatial organization. So in the pre-antibiotic era, we might say, infections were managed through a careful attention to the environment of the body, space, the movement and circulation of air, fresh air, the benefits even of sunlight. But with the arrival of antibiotics, the fresh air wards of the pre-antibiotic era gave way to high density, high rise healthcare environments. So late 20th century hospitals have a very tight geometry, low ceilings, densely arranged ward bays. To get around these spaces, you have to enter the confines of lifts and elevators, often in close proximity with others. So the historian Robert Budd and others have suggested that antibiotics have concentrated healthcare delivery within ever more efficiently compact architectural designs. And arguably, what makes these kinds of spaces possible is the very availability of antibiotics and arguably vaccines. So transmissible infections become a matter for pharmacology rather than design, antibiotics and vaccines rather than space and air. The era ushered in by COVID-19 has dramatically returned and reintroduced the space of the body, the immediate atmosphere of the body, calling into question all those spatial, architectural and design principles premised on maximizing efficiency through the shrinking concentration of bodies within ever diminishing built environments. So what does this mean? Well, just as we're starting to think about post-antibiotic architectures and designs, we're now inevitably speculating upon post-COVID-19 architectures and designs, and we're seeing that happen.
Nik, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, okay. So social distancing, we're likely to face several years where social distancing becomes deeply habituated for all of us. Face masks, we're unlikely now to think of face masks as something normalized only in East Asia. Corridors and passing points, in our work with people with CF, they're often told to keep 2 meters apart, but in hospital corridors far narrower than that and often cluttered with kit. In terms of pathways, the Berlin suburb of Kreuzberg last week doubled the width of its cycleways to enable social distancing. So eating into the vast volume of space gobbled up by cars. And links between pollution and poor outcomes for COVID-19 patients have led to calls to entirely redraw urban infrastructure. So finally, a feature by Oliver Wainwright last week similarly speculates on a post-COVID-19 world of design that takes account of things like home working, makes connectivity political, that questions the shrinking of domestic environments, that calls for lower density workplaces, that focuses architectural attention on being able to open windows that are now designed out of many buildings, the wider corridors, more staircases instead of elevators and lifts, contactless doors and buttonless entrances and exits, a focus on the greening and rewilding of indoor and outdoor environments, designs for walkable cities, relocalizing amenities, workplaces and residential worlds, ways of making vibrant, dense cities spaces more livable. And all of that brings back the space of the body. And I think it remains to be seen whether and to what extent this emergency creates openings and possibilities for more livable ways of life and living, and who knows. So I'd just like to finish by thanking my colleagues at York, Manchester, Sheffield, Liverpool, and the Royal College of Art. Thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you, Nik. Okay, I'm now turning to Ipek, are you there?
I am, but I'm still seeing, oh, yeah.
Well, there's always going to be a little bit of a falter, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, off you go.
I'm trying to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it now. Okay?
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And to the BSA. Well, that the West on the whole has underestimated COVID-19 is now well established, from the President of the EU Commission to the Director of WHO to Dr. Horton of the Lancet, who argued that the growing global pandemic was not taken seriously early on, despite the warnings from China. Of course, if we look at these warnings, or when we came to know, you'll remember in late December, China alerted WHO. There might have been a delay in this, but we have known since then. As early as January 11, Chinese scientists revealed the draft genome of the virus. And then later, again, as early as 31st of January, the Lancet published an article by Joseph Wu and colleagues from Hong Kong. They both underlined the seriousness of this and also called for urgent reparations, including securing supply chains of pharmaceuticals, PPEs, hospital supplies, so on and so forth. In March, in the UK, which is the more focus of my talk, the UK government, not the whole West, of course, when we did start talking about what to do about this coronavirus, the threat was downplayed. The advice and techniques from China, South Korea, and the WHO were not followed. Social distancing measures, contact tracing were not implemented, and minimizing economic disruption was prioritized. The chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, outlined that UK strategy was called herd immunity. You will have heard how this herd immunity then came to be called epidemiological neoliberalism, drawing a comparison between neoliberalism's faith in markets and unregulated markets and unregulated epidemics. Now, what's interesting here is that the UK government strategy, of course, changed since then, and this was presented as having shifted following expertise and scientific evidence, mainly referring to the report from Imperial College in March. But of course, this was one of many. In fact, as the editor of Lancet highlighted, it wasn't the science that had changed, but the UK government's strategy. It is interesting for us to note that expertise came to be called in by those who came into government through denigrating it. So why was this virus underestimated in the West? Why was there a delay in implementing? So that's the thing that, of course, people have been asking. So implementing measures that others in China, South Korea, and so on were employing. As of yesterday, South Korea, for example, has only had 237 deaths overall and never even went to lockdown like us. Yes, Asian countries did learn from SARS, so maybe they were better prepared, but in some sense, that's even more reason that we could have perhaps followed their approaches explicitly and their cautions a bit more closely. So was it due to incompetence? Was it due to what came to be called British exceptionalism? Was it due to ideology, prioritizing the economy, or austerity measures that might have come in the way of pandemic planning? I mean, people argued the planning was there, but the implementation wasn't. And of course, the nudge unit, the government's behavioral science unit, wasn't their priorities. I mean, it's interesting that the nudge unit itself had to be nudged into action by the British public. You will recall that the football league in the UK, they actually, for example, did social distancing much before. So perhaps some of these, but I argue that there is more to the story, and for that we need to turn into risk and culture, understanding the relationship between, looking more deeply into risk research from sociology. So we know overall from social scientific research that judgments of risk are affected, amongst others, by gender, race, political worldviews, trust, and so on. And these don't just affect lay people, they also affect experts. Our responses to risk can be non-reflexive, they are not necessarily cost-benefit analysis. They can be shaped by emotions, morals, affinity, aesthetics. So, for example, consider cosmetic surgery. We also know from risk research that risks are judged as higher by women than by men, and racial differences in risk perception do exist.
2 minutes, Ipek.
Sorry?
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Oh, really? Okay. So I should perhaps highlight then what we deem as risky is social and is closely bound up with who will be affected and whom we trust and capable for solving it. And in this case, that we listen to risk judgments and solutions of certain groups is evident. So in terms of risk research then, I would argue that a serious examination of Western-centric attitudes and their impact on risk judgments should also be an aspect of risk research. And risk research is obviously quite wide. There are studies of risk which are about the non-West, though it doesn't yet make Western-centrism a core aspect of understanding risk decision-making in the West. Instead, it tends to focus on how others reason when it comes to risk. West's view of itself and of others and how these impact on risk decisions has not been a central concern. And secondly, my last 2 points, when the non-West is considered in terms of risk, the arguments are usually trapped in back risk modernity paradigm or the paradigm of multiple modernities, which leave the miracle Europe view sacrosanct, thus continuing to reproduce problematic conceptualizations. So these central things need to be thought through after the pandemic in terms of risk research. My last sentence is that last but not least, we know that in the UK and US, ethnic minorities were disproportionately affected, that the dynamics of race, ethnicity, and class have become even more visible. We thus see the operations of racism, not just globally, which was the focus of my talk today, but also locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ipek. Now we'll turn to Bridget.
Hi.
Hang on. Yeah.
See if it's working.
There we go. Working now.
Okay. Right, is that okay?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so when I was a kid, I really wanted to be a librarian. And for some reason, that meant that every book I could lay my hand on, I would write my address like this in it. And the microbiological doesn't figure here, but actually I feel quite returned to this kind of way of seeing myself in a kind of Russian nested doll. Even though the kind of scales, the microbiological seems to actually telescope the scales at the same time somehow. So I'm kind of trying to think about what's happening with scale. But it seems to me that actually the scale of the nation is doing a lot of work in terms of how our experiences are being represented to each other. And actually, I think the NHS is doing some interesting work here. To quote Boris Johnson's speech when he left hospital, he said, "We will defeat this coronavirus and defeat it together. We will win because our NHS is the beating heart of this country. It is the best of this country. It is unconquerable. It is powered by love." And I think one reason why this didn't really seem utterly cringeworthy is because actually most of us know someone who either directly or indirectly works for the NHS. So there's this kind of personal link, I think, this personal connection between ourselves and the National Health Service. The motivating slogan for lockdown is stay home, protect the NHS and save lives. So keeping our bodies in the domestic will, it seems, save the beating heart of the nation. But the NHS is only one of multiple ways in which the nation is being called on in our current circumstances. Every day we have our updates in kind of Georgian panelled room, flanked by Union Jacks. There's, I'm sure everyone's picked up on the kind of multiple rhetorics of war. We're being enlisted. Johnson says we're fighting a national battle. And the nation seems to be the bridge between what Edouard Louis would call the politics of style and the politics of life and death. Now, I'm flagging this not because I want to kind of sneer at clap for carers or because I don't think the NHS isn't important and people are doing fantastic work, but because I'm wary of where this solidaristic nationalism is taking us. The nation, crudely put, I think displaces challenges, but it doesn't actually resolve them. And national governments, but that's not to say that where we are, where we're living doesn't matter. So national governments and their policies really matter. They matter in terms of like literally life and death. They matter in terms of the economy. But nevertheless, I think seeing it as but that doesn't mean that we're fighting a national battle. In fact, we're facing a human crisis. So we've heard how the UK is suffering a terrible an acute ventilator shortage. The numbers are much debated, but say Matt Hancock says there are 12,000 in this country. Across 41 African states that replied to a survey done by the WHO, out of those 41, they shared 2,000 ventilators. Nigeria has 100 ventilators. Somalia has no ventilators. And that's a problem, not just for people in Nigeria and Somalia, but it's a problem for all of us. And it's quite difficult to see that hunkered down as we are in our kind of national spaces. And also, you know, also thinking nationally, I think sort of encourages this idea that we're all in it together. Now, I'm pleased to say that this is already kind of, this sort of language is already unraveling, and Ipek mentioned the fact that it's already clear that Black and minority ethnic people are experiencing both sickness and death, and also the hardships of lockdown and the fears of economic disaster kind of particularly sharply. But we haven't seen anything, I note, on COVID and migration. And I say this not because I want to encourage hierarchies of oppression, but because I think that there's something about assumptions of citizenship that impoverish our understanding of what Ruth Gilmore calls, and I quote, the distinctly yet densely interconnected political geographies that produce the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. That's what we're seeing globally, and it's what we're seeing in different nation states. And that's how she defines racism. Now, I think thinking about this is particularly important at a time when the virus is really being used as an excuse to further brutal crackdowns on migration. So I don't know if anyone saw, but the UK is now in partnering up with Greece and has got a special border force cutter, which is being deployed in the Eastern Mediterranean as from yesterday. But also migrant is a word that's being used to designate, so always, I would say, or tends to be a word that's used to designate someone whose movement is a problem. And now migrants are being stopped even from returning to their states of citizenship. So both India and the Philippines, for example, have refused to accept their citizens from Kuwait because they say they don't have, they need sort of health, what's the word, health reassurances. So, you know, we've seen the first immunity passports launched in Chile. At the moment, the idea is that they're being used to monitor the movement of citizens, but I think that where this policy might stick is with the movement of migrants. Because the fact is that in a globally integrated economy, movement can't simply be stopped. So in a recent webinar I did for the EUI with Frederick Perschel, whose slide this is, he illustrated how non-citizens account for a substantial share of employment in many sectors that are now defined as essential. And one of the things that I think we've all seen and that I hope is going to stay with us is how many low-wage, low-status sectors and jobs are actually doing incredibly valuable and sustaining work. Now, that's also disproportionately work that's done by Black and minority ethnic people and also by migrants. This includes health services, which were already under strain. And what we can see is they've been put under even more strain, and this time there's no quick migration fix because borders have been closed. So states have responded to this in different ways. So in some states, asylum seekers are now being given, medically trained asylum seekers and refugees are being given the right to practice. In the UK, there's been an extension for a cost-free visa extension for certain medical professions for a year so that they can carry on saving our lives. But I think what we can see with the NHS is that it is actually powered as much by migration as it is powered by Boris Johnson's love. So 28% of doctors and 15% of nurses are non-citizens, and nurses are, migrant nurses are paid significantly less. I think it's 22% less than British citizens. And we all know about the NHS surcharges, which are about to go up. And I put this tweet, that Matt Hancock's tweet from November 17th up. It's not an international health service, it's a national health service, so he says. So the embeddedness of human movement in our economies is illustrated by the continuing demand for temporary migrants to harvest crops in the spring and summer of 2020. So while yesterday, I think it was, Trump sort of theatrically declared that there was going to be an immigration ban, that does not include hundreds of thousands of temporary workers, most significantly temporary agricultural workers. And the European Commission has asked that the movement of seasonal agricultural workers be considered the movement of essential workers across the board in the EU. And we know about the number of Romanian migrants who are now being brought to the UK, because actually movement is necessary to keep food on the table. And again, just trying to think outside the national box, it's not simply that Britain now needs migrant workers to harvest food in East Anglia. It's also that the food that is on our tables that comes from Spain is also being harvested by migrant workers. So we need to think, I think, in this much more global food supply chain kind of way, and think about how these systems actually interact globally as well as national. So we need to think beyond just sort of national policies.
2 minutes, Bridget.
Okay, so we need to think of this as systemic and see it not just about Britain, and also think not just about migration, but actually the connections between different forms of mobilities of capital, mobilities of food, of humans, and of animals. So we don't just see the virus as originating in China. So if anyone hasn't been reading him, I recommend people look at the work of Rob Wallace, who's written brilliantly about how across the world, big business has undermined food security, pushing people into difficult to cultivate areas, encouraging the growth of factory farming, and in multiple ways, making the space for this virus, for the intersection between the socioeconomic and the biological, which is part of our lives, which is part of our humanity, turning that toxic. And actually, the roots of that are not only in China, the roots of that are also in London, in New York, and in Paris, across and in many other global cities. So I think that we need to think outside my sort of not being like a little kid, my nested dolls, but also in this much more expansive way. So just to end by quoting Milton Friedman, he said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." So times like this exposed how politicized judgments of what's reasonable and what's realistic really are. A national lens normalizes strict mobility controls and hyper-surveillance and the association of race and disease, distracts from powerful financial and industrial interests that shape this interface between the socioeconomic and the biological, and bizarrely makes preventing human movement more imaginable than planetary public health, which is where our energies should be devoted. Thank you.
Very much, Bridget. And now we'll turn to Susan.
I need Bridget to stop sharing her
screen. Yeah. Got it. Good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I want to start with an observation, which is that amidst the truly terrible daily death toll, amidst the endless revelation of systemic failures and inequalities as this pandemic is working its way around the globe, there are growing calls, it seems, for a different future. This is not for a return to normal at all, which some people have been calling for, but rather for the creation of something else for the creation of a world where, as others have alluded to already, health inequalities are taken seriously, where essential workers, what an interesting term that's come to be, are rewarded adequately, where precarity is understood as a social risk and not as an individual failing, where, for example, carbon emissions can be reduced by 25% in a matter of weeks rather than being argued over for many, many decades. For example, as Arundhati Roy argued recently in her article in the Financial Times, historically pandemics have forced humans to break with past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. In the few minutes I have, I want to ask the question, what part will digital technologies play in this? And actually, I've lost count over the past few weeks, the number of times that it has been said to me, it's technology that is getting us through the crisis. And in one way, that's true. So here we are on Zoom doing this strange thing that we've not done before. Millions of people, tens of millions of people who never imagined they would be working from home have started to do so overnight. The wholesale shift to online education that's happening before our eyes is really remarkable. And that's before we get to the spectacle of the giant tech companies actually offering to share their carefully guarded proprietary data for free with governments for tracking contagion and, as they would argue, for driving some of the most successful virus mitigation strategies around the world. And I'll come back to that. And yet, as you see on my slide, this innovation, the changes we're seeing so far are not largely technical. Yes, there's had to be some pretty rapid work around extending network capabilities, and that's not to be underestimated. Yes, some new apps have been developed, but far more than any of this, it is the changing social, political, economic relations of technology that is getting us through. Things that had seemed simply impossible turn out to be possible. And far from bridging a gap, in Roy's terms, between one world and the next, far from just being a temporary or neutral bridge whilst we wait to see what kind of new world might emerge after the shock of COVID, my argument is, and I think it's pretty obvious, that these socio-technical transformations that we're witnessing now are already assembling potential futures as we speak. We are not going to row back on some of these changes. So if we're going to take Roy's injunction seriously, and I think we must, we need to begin right now with looking at the present day politics and practices of the futures that are being assembled with digital technologies in the present moment. The first question I think we need to ask is which actors' expectations and resources are being mobilized towards what kinds of futures? And I think we can identify many, many different kinds of futures that are being assembled here. I'll just mention three. The first, Ben Williamson's excellent blog on the edtech industry in the crisis shows how global edtech vendors and promoters are very, very actively building coalitions with governments, with NGOs and with others to really turbocharge their business in the context of the crisis. And to bring with it, of course, the individualized and very neoliberal model of education that is hardwired into those online education systems. A different example, we might look to the standoff that's emerged last week between Apple and the government over what terms they would ask for in sharing their data with the government, with Apple in particular insisting on the continuity of its privacy settings, which of course are so important to its organisational ethos, but also to its business model, as a condition of sharing data with the UK government, which didn't actually seem quite so keen on taking those privacy settings on board. Or another example of the futures that are being worked on right now, the civic organisations, the alliances at all scales from the local to global that are being pulled together, civic groups, technologists, businesses and NGOs committed to ethical technologies, to data justice, to responsible innovation, have been absolutely invigorated in the current crisis, calling out the iniquitous implications of data sharing, calling out the normalisation of surveillance and keeping these issues, at least to some extent, in the centre of public debate, even in the middle of the worst public health crisis that most of us can ever remember. Now, of course, there are major power imbalances between these different networks and mobilisations of digital futures. I have to say that really clearly and loudly. But these digital futures that are emerging, that are being assembled right now, are not a done deal. And in these accelerated and really turbulent times, I think it is more important than ever that we keep the politics of technology alive, and that we keep this politics alive way beyond questions of anonymity and consent, which of course are really important, but which really just allow business as usual to carry on, and that we try to move towards something that looks more like an expansive responsibility, to borrow Donna Haraway's terms, towards digital futures. So there's just 3 simple points that I want to make following up on that. The first one is that future making has by and large been almost entirely a prerogative of the elite. Who presents the future really matters. Who has the assets of one sort or another to shape the future is a question of privilege, inequality, and social justice. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the field of technology, where often unreflexive and iniquitous assumptions are coded into the creation and the implementation of technological systems. So long as making technology and socio-technical futures carry on to be created in that way, we will be constrained by the kind of narrow claims that I started this presentation with. The idea that keeping the middle classes online or ensuring the continuity of what are basically very privileged educational systems is somehow the same as getting us through the crisis, or that biometric IDs are somehow neutral with equivalent implications for all citizens. We need to be urgently asking right now, who are these socio-technical innovations for? What works well for whom? What worlds are being made and what worlds are being denied as we see this rapid escalation of socio-technical innovation? And we need to ask that now, I think, whilst this door is open, whilst things that seemed impossible seem to be possible, how might socio-technical innovation be done differently to drive towards remaking digital futures? The second point I want to make is, again, a huge and perhaps obvious one, but it is that in order for this to be meaningful, futures cannot come top down from industry, government, or the academy alone. Of course, they will come from all of those places, but remaking the future demands inclusive and participatory approaches that stretch way beyond the standard mechanisms for public engagement in science. Remaking the future, it won't be done with deficit models. It won't be done by assuming that we just need didactic approaches to educate people. Or worse, that we need to engage with the public in order to improve trust and the acceptance of already imagined technologies. Rather, what we need, and I'm aware this is a big claim, is to empower meaningful public debate and dialogue about socio-technical futures that are in the making, that are alive, that are active, that are not yet done. And if we get to that, I think the question of trust and acceptance, which dominate this debate so far, will disappear, because actually they're second order questions.
2 minutes, Bridget. Susan.
Yep. Third and finally, this has got to be more than hope or aspiration. For all that imaginaries can be really important in driving change, we have to think about how we actually make digital futures in concrete terms. We have the opportunity to draw on some existing approaches. I won't say more now, but from Ruth Lefetas's work on utopia as a method, from the work of Alex Wilkie, Rachel Coleman and Rebecca Coleman and others on speculative design, and in my own world through interdisciplinary collaboration across the social and engineering sciences to really turbocharge those alliances between social scientists, the technologists, the engineers, who are already aligned with thinking around inclusive and sustainable futures. And we need to think about how to create the future in purposive directions. Finally, to say we have to do this really rapidly, because government and industry now are already starting to look at spending enormous amounts of money on restarting the economy and the society post-COVID. Post-COVID is a really problematic term because we will live with the consequences of this for the rest of our lives. How that future shapes up will not only be about technologies, but of course other things. But my call here is to end for strengthened critique, for strengthened engagement with the potential that out of this shock we can rethink and remake digital futures. And this is my final point. We must think not only about human futures in the context of rapidly changing technology, but technology futures in the context of complex, unequal and fragile societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And now our final speaker, turn to Danny Dorling.
Thank you. Let's try playing the PowerPoint. Can you see a PowerPoint there?
Yeah, you just need to put it on slideshow, yeah?
There we go.
Perfect.
Thanks so much for having me. I'd like to try to get us to step back a little bit. Stepping back during what hopefully is the peak of the pandemic is really, really difficult, because you think day by day at the moment, you think week by week, you don't tend to think what will I be doing in 3 months' time. And you look back a couple of months and you think, what on earth was I thinking? But pandemics, even this one, which is not as large as 1918-19, which may not be as large as the 1968 pandemic, which I suspect hardly any of you can remember, even if you were in it, but it killed 1 million people worldwide. The time comes when the pandemic is over. And there were long-term trends occurring anyway, and those long-term trends will continue. But of course, there'll be an influence in terms of what has recently happened. I've spent 6 years looking at long-term trends, and the one interesting thing I have to say to you is that I was expecting to find many things accelerating and increasing, and what I found was a whole set of things slowing down faster than people thought they were, even before this process that we're currently in began. And I'm going to show you some graphs. Normally, it's very difficult to explain these graphs. This is by far the most complicated one. But of course, right now, it is rather easy to explain to people the issues of acceleration and deceleration and why it matters if something is going up, but up slightly more slowly than it was before. So what is this graph? This graph on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is showing the number of cases of people who died each day, often by hospital records in these 7 countries. And on the horizontal axis, there's the rate of change. So the faster the increase, the further to the right the line swings. When the line swings over the central axis, it means you're getting a reduction in the rise. Still rising, but not as fast. And the further it goes to the right, the faster the deceleration. Now, hopefully you're looking around and trying to work it out. I told you this is by far the most complicated graph I'm going to show, but you're interested in it because you want to know what's happening. Right at the very bottom of the graph is a tiny little purple line. That's China. Tiny number of people have died in China. And you'll see little wiggles in that tiny purple line at the bottom. Because as this thing rises and as it falls, it loops. I won't go any further than that unless anyone wants to ask, but it's interesting. The line above that purple line is red. It's Germany. The great success story of Europe. This data is about a week old. For those of you who are feeling down at the moment, I can tell you, if you update this graph, it gets better news. There is kind of good news out there. The dark blue line is the United States. Of course, much bigger population came later and zooms off and above. But even in the United States, it's now probably past the peak, or at least past the first peak. The light blue line is France. France looks bad because in France, they included all the care home deaths as well from quite early on. We are the green line. Now, if you add the care home deaths, which are not there, our line is actually almost identical to France's. But what matters isn't that. What matters is you can see we're beginning to loop down. We're on our first loop down. Italy and Spain were already looping, and it carries on. Now, I'm not showing you that because I want to talk about the pandemic. I'm showing you that because I want to talk about acceleration, deceleration, and these kinds of graphs. I'm going to zip forward quickly for a few of them. The conventional way in which you look at change over time is like this. This is a population graph. This is the kind of graph that's normally used to scare university students into thinking everything's going to come to an end. It's all terrible. And it all depends on how you draw these things. And you'll be aware of this particular kind of graph. Let me show you a different way. This is that same graph, but now drawn where on the horizontal axis you've got the rate of change, and on the vertical axis you've got the total number of people. This is in the world. And looking at it this way, you can see that the rate of change stopped increasing from about 1990, stayed pretty high, another 80 million people every year. And we're currently set to have absolutely rapid deceleration. And in our grandchildren's lifetime, we will have the first ever stabilization of the human species since it became a species. It's a kind of good news story. I don't have time to leave these things on too long, but I'm just trying to give you an idea. Exactly the same data as in that last scary graph, but looked at it a very different way. I'm going to log it for anybody who's particularly nerdy, and it provides a kind of summary of the major demographic events of the species of the last 2,000 years. 1492, what did we do? We took an infectious disease to the Americas, hence the dent. 1820, 1830, 1840, what did we do? We destroyed civilizations across Africa and much of the rest of the world. This slowdown, the little red dot showing it now, is not because of pandemics as in the past, not because of wars, not because of colonialism. This is because people are taking control, and particularly women, of their own bodies. Let's get off demography though, and soon forward to something else. This is GDP. Now we tend to look at GDP, and when it slows down, we tend to ascribe that to particular events. We have a tendency to say, oh, that was due to the oil crash in the 70s, or that was due to the recession of the 80s, or that was the dot-com crash, or that was the 2008 great global recession. But this particular way of looking at it, you can perhaps see that it was generally slowing, absolutely, since 2006. Still rising, but not rising as quickly. The next graph, exactly the same data, but a log scale. And if you squint, you can see that 1950 was the highest rate of acceleration of GDP. And that thing is moving, shifting towards the left. Rising, but on average, less each decade compared to the decade before. Now, this is before the pandemic. Why does this matter? Why does it matter? I looked at the effect of pandemics in this book, Slowdown book. And pandemics, well, at least since 1665, they tended to have very small effects. The 1918-1919 flu pandemic resulted in a 14% drop in world GDP, which then rose by 16% the next year. The 1968 pandemic, almost no effect whatsoever. However, this pandemic, a relatively small pandemic, hopefully, has hit at a time when we are decelerating, unlike those previous ones, and that may matter. Things which aren't decelerating. I only found 4 things, and I looked at thousands. Only 4 things are actually accelerating. And of course, you can't have many things accelerating all the time. Everything has to come down. And the 4, at least 3 of them are rather obvious. This is carbon emissions. How many billions of tons of carbon we're emitting. And you'll see it's kind of leaning towards the right. So it's not just that we're emitting more each year, but we're actually emitting even more than the year before on average. And sadly, every time we have one of these global meetings like at Paris and Kyoto and so on, we tend to congratulate ourselves, take our eye off the ball, and admit even more in the years after one of those meetings than we did before. So that's one of our disaster scenarios, carbon emissions. That's what it looks like on a conventional graph, by the way. And the reason I'm drawing these weird graphs is because it really highlights the inflections, the moment of change, because that's what we're interested in. You know, if there is going to be a change to the long-term trend, there'll be a little hint at it at the beginning before then. Anyway, this is where we were. And as Susan said earlier, China, 25% down carbon emissions in just a few weeks at the very start of this crisis. It'll be much, much, much lower now. Why do we worry about carbon? We worry about carbon because of temperature. Here's one of several temperature graphs. This is temperature rising to be a degree above normal according to NASA, and it's leading the wrong way. It's going right. So global temperature was not just increasing, it was increasing by slightly more each year than the year before, and became absolutely obvious after 2009, which is why the climate skeptics will shut up and then found some other obnoxious thing to get involved in. Temperature, quietly, and please don't spread this because it's irresponsible to say it, but the NASA estimate of global temperature for February 2020 is 1/10 of a degree below February 2019. We get the data every month. Temperature is complicated, but we may not just see a fall in carbon this year. We may actually begin to see a stalling in the rise of temperatures, because the relationship really can be that close. And if you look at the temperatures on this one, you'll see that they don't rise very quickly in 1983, which was a global recession, or in 1990, which was a global recession, or in 2008, 2009, you'll see they're not rising. Global recessions are about the best thing you can have for not increasing global temperatures. There's the 2008 one. GDP, China was slowing before the crisis began. The world was heading towards a global economic recession before this began. Do not think that everything that was happening before this began is immaterial. It really should matter. And my evidence for that is those previous pandemics, flu 1968, 1957, 1951, and 1918, did not dent the trend, but the trend was going the other way. This trend was already slowing before this pandemic hit. Stock prices. Stocks and shares, this is the NASDAQ, this is the .com crash. It's a kind of wonderful roller coaster, loop the loop. There it goes, round once, round again, okay? And that's a big shock to investors. But after 2008, 2009, the NASDAQ goes up and up and up. Everybody thinks the pension fund is fun, the USS is okay, whatever's all right, and there it goes to 2019. This way of drawing graphs doesn't predict the future, but it kind of shows you how precarious the past was. Not many more to go. This is the third of the only 4 things I found accelerating.
2 minutes, Jenny.
Okay, not a bad thing at all. This is university graduates worldwide. But we'll probably see a deceleration in that. If we work in universities, this is what we're slightly terrified about at the moment. Things that are odd or may surprise you at first, the rate of extinction of species was not accelerating. Sounds like good news, and it is, but if the rate of species had actually carried on at the rate we were losing species in the 80s, we'd all be dead. So it's good that that's decelerating. Anyway, I thought I should show that. And here's the fourth. I looked at over 1,000 global trends. I only found 4 that were accelerating. They are all falling now. Air flights, a tiny numbers. Hardly any of us fly on the world. Fewer people fly every year as a proportion of the global population than before. But the tiny numbers who are flying, we were flying 4 billion trips a year. And of course, that has ended. Now it'll start again. I don't think it'll ever get back to where it was in 2017, 18, 19. Almost at the end. I didn't invent these graphs. These were invented by social scientists in Japan in the 1970s. And it's interesting that one of the most stable places in the world in terms of change not occurring that quickly, in terms of what we call 2 lost decades, in the place with the highest life expectancy in the world. They draw these graphs before. This is one about Tokyo beginning not to change. And of course, these come from scientists. So you might dislike the fact that physicists use these, but it's ways of plotting the dampening of a pendulum. It's all about change and trying to understand how things are slowing down. And it helps you think, I think, in different ways. My last slide, before I get muted, so you can, Jeremy's very good, you can read a few words there. We have no idea how this is going to play out. There's an enormous amount of fear at the moment. There are incredible arguments between brilliant epidemiologists as to whether the fatality rate is 3%, which would be truly awful, or 0.3%, or even 0.1%. So we don't know, but we're going to know so much more in about a month. As was argued before, Bridget said, we shouldn't be obsessed by individual countries. It's how our data tends to be collected. But clearly, the fact that the curves of France and the UK are so incredibly close, that even with our, I would say, fairly spectacularly incompetent C-team cabinet, possibly the worst cabinet ever, it didn't make that much difference to the actual trends in what's happened, that we had a less able government than other European countries have had. There will be fewer flights in future. The wealth of billionaires has fallen by at least 1/3 and possibly by 1/2 by now because stocks and shares have fallen. The London housing market is simply not going to be there in any fashion than it was before. Although the people who suffer most at the moment are the poorest have no wealth to lose. And enormous amounts of wealth have simply evaporated. They simply don't exist anymore. And that wealth is not going to come back in the form it was, because it relied on sentiment. The idea that a property was worth this much, the idea that stocks and shares would rise in future, the idea that terrible events couldn't happen. And of course, now we've learned again that pandemics can happen. Once this one is over, at least us for the rest of our lives will be wondering, when's the next one going to come? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Okay. You stop sharing your screen.
Yep.
Great. Lovely. Right, now we've got quite a few questions that have come in. I will do my best to field them. Before I do that, there's a couple of people asking whether they'll be able to see these presentations after the event, and the answer to that is yes. This will be on the BSA website, and I think it's also going out as a Vimeo, but I'm not quite sure where yet. But first question I think is for Nik from Jenny Poppe. She says, already seeing forms of narrative resistance to the dominant discourse on social distancing, with the emergence of alternative discourse that articulates the concept of physical distancing as social practice that requires or is dependent on extensive social solidarity. What does Nik think about these developments? Sorry, I'm just going to have to read these questions as well as I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah, you're all unmuted at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, this whole slippage between social distancing and then physical distancing, and then, you know, attention to all kinds of different notions of shielding, all of these kinds of, you know, very kind of fragile and delicate sort of biopolitical dispositions that seem to be bubbling up and distinctions that seem to be bubbling up. I mean, I think in response to your question, what interests me, I think, is the politics of blame and attribution of culpability, which is generating throughout all sorts of communities on a kind of on all sorts of layers. So both the micro-political in terms of people, you know, kind of correcting one another and all of the kind of shaming that's going on, but also then on the kind of, you know, much more macro political sort of level to do with the securitization of national borders and all sorts of things like that. So not just kind of individual physical borders, but national borders. So I think in my response to the question is to kind of think about the sort of discourses of blame and the attribution of culpability and notions of othering that accompany these kinds of discourses.
Okay, thanks, Nik. Got a question now that isn't for anybody specifically, from Vanessa Ashall. She wants to know, she's saying non-human animals haven't been mentioned today, but do any of the speakers have a view about how the COVID pandemic might influence the growing sociological interest in human, non-human animal relationships in the context of health and medicine? Who wants to take that one? Anybody? That one for you. Oh, Bridget, yeah, lovely.
I'm not sure I can really answer it, but I do think that this question of the situating the relation between the human and the non-human, including the microbiological and the politics of that, I think is and should be increasingly important. So, you know, understanding our relationship with our biological relationship with the world that we inhabit and that we share with animals, and that that is also part of our societies and part of our economies, and seeing how that biological and reproductive demand and the socio-economic fit together, pull in certain directions, clash in others. I think we really need to be paying much more attention to that, and much more attention to thinking about the agents, you know, the agency of the non-human as well. Told you I wasn't going to be able to answer it, but I think it's great.
Anybody else want to come in there? No, we'll move on. Okay, I'm going to stay with you, Bridget, for a minute. This is a question from Alexandra Bulla. And she'd like you to expand on your reflections about the impact on UK immigration policy. So asking, to what extent is there space now for bold policy changes like dismantling hostile environment policies, status for all, etc.?
I think there is that possibility, and I think we have to make it. It's not just going to happen. So I think, so one question is status for all. I mean, there's across in many countries, including France, but also the UK, there are now the beginnings of campaigns and demands for status for all. There's been ways in which, I mean, our government is not lifting the no recourse to public funds requirement, but it is saying that local authorities need to house people with no recourse to public funds. And it's saying that people who, you can be tested for COVID-19 and not have to pay if you're not a citizen. So these are very small, very meager responses, but nevertheless, they are kind of openings that can be leveraged out. I think in some ways, the big question is, you know, it's been exposed, I think, the multiple ways in which we're reliant on migrant workers. I mean, I mentioned agriculture and also care. And I think we can see with social care how many of the people working in those sectors are also not necessarily on migrant worker visas. You know, they're on spousal visas, or they may be on some kind of permanent residence visas, but they don't show up as migrant workers. So I think kind of really teasing open the ways in which we are dependent on non-citizen labour, and thinking through the fact that we do not give equal rights to that labour, I think is going to be a key sort of point of, you know, when we're clapping for carers, let's clap for carers, not only about PPE, but about giving rights of residence and stable resident status, and not only for doctors and nurses, but also for porters, for care assistants and for cleaners, just as a start.
Thank you, Bridget. Okay, I've got two questions here from Akila Kumaran, one for Ipek, and the question is, when we speak of issues within the Western-centric discourses, are we overlooking inequalities inherent in the systems of the global south, like caste in India?
You're muted.
Oh, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, I had muted myself. I was coughing before. Yeah, I think Westerncentrism is a way of thinking. So not all in the West have it, but also those in the non-West have it. So for example, Western-centric reasoning can, I mean, in some ways I talked about how it can mitigate our help against the West, but it also circulates and gets transported to the non-West. So these are kind of facts. But in terms of inequalities elsewhere, so obviously inequalities and prejudices exist elsewhere, and you know, we're not going to deny or absolve people of those sorts of responsibilities. So talking about Western-centricism doesn't mean that, you know, we don't need to create those sorts of big essentialist constructions. Not all in the West have a Western-centric point of view.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And one for Nik, about whether we're looking at a return to pre-antibiotic hospital architecture, or is there a role for the development of telemedicine, for instance? Where might we be going with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have to be very careful with some of these kinds of utopian impulses that that can surround these kinds of issues. I do think there's a very critical questioning that's developing in the fields of design and architecture, where there are serious concerns about the healthcare implications of particular forms of design. And certainly the kind of densification that we've seen in both the domestic but also in kind of public buildings and in the healthcare context. So, I mean, I've undertaken experiments with participants about how they might go about designing hospital architectures along different kinds of principles that are premised upon the access to fresh air and sunlight and gardens and reduced heights and the less of the kind of verticalization of these kinds of environments. And they're very difficult. It's very difficult to kind of get away from entrenched ways of moving about, entrenched ways of delivering healthcare. But I do think that is happening in the context of antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. And I think inevitably it's going to happen in some way, shape or other in the context of COVID. Telemedicine, I think, I think as sociologists, we've been very good at offering some really insightful critiques of the limitations of that kind of care. And the extent to which it's restricted in lots of ways. And I think we need to kind of keep a very astute and watchful brief on the kinds of design developments coming out of this emergency.
Thanks. Okay, I've got some questions for Danny. I've got a few people wanting to know about the software you use for your slides, Danny. So we'll come to that, but I'll give you the other two first. Well, one's sort of prompted by your presentation, and it's from Tim May saying, given the freneticism we've seen in the pursuit of profit and associated searches for reducing costs by moving across the globe for production, how do you see the pandemic tempering these aspirations, and what are the possible consequences for different ways of life? And secondly, from Ruth Beresford, who's encouraged to hear that great economic inequality will be hard to sustain. What politics and ideology do you think there is or there needs to be to support that, and for there to be a more democratic shift to greater equality? So
okay, thank you. Okay, the software is remarkably easy. It's just Excel. The older I get, the less able I am to use the kind of software I could when I was younger. So it's just Excel, but there's one trick, and that trick is my friend Kirsty McClure. Kirsty is normally a busker on the London Underground, and in fact looks after the union of buskers on the Underground, but she's also a graphic designer. So I just gave her the Excel sheets, and Kirsten redrew them for the publisher. But it's as simple as that. It is trivially simple. To do this. It's just that we've had a sort of 20 years of moving away from data in sociology and human geography, which has actually opened up a position where really simple graphs of basic data look novel because people haven't been looking at data for a long time. Tim's question, the whole point of what I was working on for the last 6 years was to say that we were moving in a particular direction which appeared to be away from seeing inequality as good, away from not worrying about the environment. There were lots of signs of things actually getting better. We don't tend to look for those signs because, like little magnets, we're kind of drawn to where is the disaster, what's going wrong. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the unfairness. Let's talk about the injustice. But there were lots of signs of things getting better. One was that there was a period a few years ago where the infant mortality rate in the world fell by 10% in a year. It will never fall as fast again. It can't. Finland has now got it down to some ridiculous level, like 1.7 babies dying per 1,000, one of the best rates in the world. But this isn't a thesis of we became richer and it became better. We started to care more. We've become older. We've become more educated, a little bit less vicious than we were before, and there was various pieces of evidence for that. So I published this book, finished writing it in January, which was saying many of the things that people say that we should get out of COVID were possibly on the cards before then, because the acceleration of CO2 was absolutely impossible. Now, how you get it is difficult, and that brings me lastly to Ruth's question about the politics. So the only thing I noted about the politics was I think there's been a deceleration in the creation of new political movements. And this is very, very contentious. But if you think of words like socialism, or if you think about when the Green parties were first founded in the 1970s, then you think, well, what did we do in the 80s? What did we do in the 90s? I do make an argument in this book that there's a slowing down in the invention of new kinds of isms and a maturity amongst things that are progressive. So thinking about how do you actually hardwire environmental behaviour into your thinking, which we're now seeing in incredible plans for Madrid to pedestrianise large parts of its centre as it unlocks and so on. But a more mature, more boring, well, in a way, more boring politics, because, and this is the crucial thing, in the 1920s, 30s and 40s, we were hurtling forward at an unbelievable speed in terms of what was happening to us. The tractor was only invented in 1908. People had no idea what was going to happen next. It was a roller coaster world that our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through. Our world is slower and slower, less actually happens. So when something like this happens, it blows us completely off course because we're used to the utter predictability. You know, there weren't going to be any pandemics, there weren't going to be any wars. We might occasionally get an economic crash, and if you're middle class, that's slightly disappointing. But because things have slowed down, when we get something like this, it is an incredible shock because we can't think of something similar in our lives. Because we've been lucky, because we've lived through a slower period of change than previous generations have.
Thanks, Danny. Okay, I've got a couple of questions for Susan. I'll give you the first one, Susan, and I'll have to find the other one. Okay, this is from Abby Winton. We know that digital futures and socio-technical change has the potential to exacerbate inequalities of gender and class. To what extent do you believe that this pandemic offers an opportunity to close these gaps?
I think that depends on whether we take seriously this argument that things have been unsettled such that we might be at a breakage point where things could look different and things that weren't possible might be possible. But the two things I would say is, first of all, we have to stop theorising technology and social processes as independent. This is not something that technology is neutral. Technology is part of social processes, and that means that we need to think about the materialities of technology as well as the discourses of technology. And I think there are opportunities to go about technology creation in ways that could both challenge as well as exacerbate inequalities.
And I've got a question about what you think these changes in higher education might mean for us. In, you know, the kinds of things you were talking about ed tech.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, one of the things that struck me is, you know, the sort of rapid acceleration of online education was that the response from some of the disability activist groups, which is that suddenly what was being achieved were the things that they had been calling for 20 or 30 years and which they had been told were impossible, suddenly seems to become possible. So, you know, there is a progressive aspect to it, but I think reading Ben Williamson's work is exactly what I recommend. So if we start to look at data-driven and the use of AI, data analytics in the provision of education, both in the classroom and online, there's some really, really serious concerns about the kind of pedagogic thinking that's embedded in those technologies and what that might mean and how that might overwrite some of the really hard-won thinking about ways of learning and different ways of learning and questions of race and racism and gender in the classroom. So I think, you know, there's some opportunities, but there's also some really profound challenges, and Ben's work really is excellent on that.
I actually quite like to open that a bit more widely, because I've got another question here from a year 13 student whose exams have been cancelled, and they're asking a general question about changes in education. So I just go to Nik first in terms of, you know, we've got this potential tension between everything going online and the whole ed tech thing, and also discussions about how university architecture might literally physically change. So I just wondered what you thought about that one.
Yes, I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I during my hours exercise, wander around the campus, the vacant campus here, where it's just a cluster of buildings that are unoccupied, and it's now a kind of a green space, a sort of parkland that's reserved for people just to kind of wander around in socially distanced kinds of ways. I mean, it is going to be extraordinary, I think, the way that it will change how we deliver teaching and how we participate in kind of pedagogic sorts of worlds. You know, the idea of going into a huge lecture hall and delivering a lecture in the way that we have done and the necessities of that, I think we're already, just to pick up Danny's point, we're already in processes of change. But anyway, I'll hand over to Susan, I think.
Well, anybody else, really? We're all in the business, aren't we? So
I can maybe just add the bit that the A-level predictions, and there's been a debate about how A-level predictions actually mispredict people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, their grades, and how will UK universities respond to this? So if we're going to be taking in students with A-level predictions, are we going to push our universities to think through their admission systems? I suppose that's very important.
Yeah.
I was just going to come up that there is an opposite effect as well, although it just affects my university. I'm at Oxford, and we made 69% of our offers this year to children from state schools, admittedly often posh state schools, but state schools. We expected to take in 67%, even though we made 69% of offers, because state schools children are more likely not to get all the A's because they're not spoon-fed as much. However, as the entry will now be based on the predicted grades, we'll now be taking 69% state school students. But
they are mostly from privileged backgrounds still, right?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Well, one interesting thing, we've been running a market experiment only since 2012. In 2012, the limits on universities were taken off. Every university in 2012 in England, if you took 0.5% more than you were allowed or 0.5% less, you were fined. 2012, £9,000 a year fees come in for AAB students, open market, any university could take any students, and the rush to the bottom occurred, and the Russell Group grew by 7% every year and so on. That's gone now. There's an agreement of no open market this year. Universities must take the same number of students as they took last year, and will attempt to do that. There's enormous fear, but that open market experiment lasted just 8 years. So 8 years, and we became used to it. This is the other thing to remember. We become used to change incredibly quickly. You can see it during wars. People become used to being in a war. It becomes normal. At universities in England, we became completely used to the idea that any university could take any number of students, despite the fact that that had not occurred before 2012. So we're looking at a change again. And also, of course, we become privatized. We're private businesses now desperately asking the government for help in exactly the same way, or not exactly the same, but a similar way to the way that 11,000 private care homes, when they're in trouble, suddenly demand that the government provide them with PPE equipment, rather than anybody saying, hold on, why aren't the shareholders and the bosses of those private care homes actually providing their employees with what they should be providing them with law?
Absolutely. I'm going to stop. Yeah. I'm going to stop you there, Danny. Sorry,
Yes, okay.
But I want this, because this is, we're going to have to wind up, or we'll all get muted because it's time limited, the session. So I want to go to Susan for a last comment on that, and then I'll wind us up. Okay.
I haven't got a last comment to make. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, it's probably a bit boring, but I heard yesterday that the government's gone very quiet on removing the numbers, or on insisting on the numbers caps. So I don't know if it's a done deal yet, but that's going to happen. But that's a very specific point. I'd just like to say thank you to you, Sue, very, very much for all the effort that you put into organising this, and for your completely brilliant chairing under, testing circumstances. So that's the final comment. Thank you, and thanks to everybody else for being.
Thank you. Just a few words from me. I know we've got a lot of frustrated people out there with really good questions. So I'm sorry I haven't been able to deal with all of them. It's just impossible. We are in a time limited session. We're looking at possible ways of dealing with other questions, but we don't know exactly what that might be yet. But some of the speakers may get emails. My apologies to those who were missed out. So we've come to the end of what has been an absolutely great session. It's been every bit as good as I hoped it would be, not my chairing necessarily, but everybody's presentations. Thank you so much. And this is the moment where we hear the applause silently. So I think we can applaud each other symbolically. So thanks to all of you. Thanks also to the participants. You know who you are. We will know who you are because we do
No, I do.
have names in the feed. Thanks for joining us and for the questions. I hope you found it interesting. There were lots of people prefacing their questions with "that was great, really interesting, thank you." I'm sure there'll be many more opportunities for sociologists and social scientists to discuss the pandemic. But just a little plug, if you're keen to read the thoughts of more of your colleagues from around the world, then have a look at the Rapid Response section of Discover Society at discoversociety.org, where we've got around 70 articles, 70 submissions, including one from Ipek, and maybe there'll be some from our other speakers before very long. So thanks to everybody. Goodbye from me and stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.